U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken held urgent talks with EU and NATO officials on boosting support for Ukraine.
Former President of the European Commission Jose Manuel Barroso says nobody believes Crimea will ever go back to Ukraine because European governments believe it's a special case.
Gazan children brought to Lebanon to treat their wounds face consequences of Israel's expansion of the war there. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Brussels on Wednesday for urgent talks with EU and NATO officials on boosting support for Ukraine. Officials anticipate a policy shift concerning U.S. support for Ukraine and NATO when Donald Trump returns to the White House. In the months leading up to the end of President Biden's term, Democrats are trying to implement as many priorities as they can while they have the majority in the Senate. While in Brussels, Blinken outlined plans for additional U.S. support to Ukraine before January.
We've obligated just recently and pushed out the door another $8 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. That was in September. Another almost $500 million just a few weeks ago. And President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th.
NATO chief Mark Rutte said instability across Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific is increasingly interconnected, pointing to Moscow buying dual-use goods from China and drone technology from Iran. Blinken emphasized that NATO would also pursue a highly intense agenda during the last months of President Joe Biden's administration.
The recent floods in Spain have led to intense scrutiny over the role of regional governments in managing climate change-related disasters. And here at COP29 in Azerbaijan, European regional leaders are asking for more investment in adaptation because they're realizing that everything from the concrete infrastructure they have to their emergency management systems are just not ready for the future. Here's the president of the European Committee of the Regions, Vasco Cordero.
Ao longo dos anos foram tomadas decisões que naturalmente na altura pareceriam as decisões mais corretas e que acabam por ter também essas consequências. Isso acontece em Valência, ou aconteceu em Valência, como aconteceu num conjunto de outras localidades afetadas por cheias, por fogos florestais, por seca.
Making investments in watercourse management is one of the kinds of proactive investments that can really pay off in the future, according to the president of the region of Bratislava, Juraj Droba.
You really have to think very well how you spend the limited amount of money that you have. What paid off in my region was building small dams in the hills, which actually streamed the little rivers in such a way that they didn't do more damage than they did. And I think this is something which doesn't cost too much. You can do it at the time of normal weather conditions, and then you are much better prepared.
There are many voices clamouring for attention here at COP29, but mayors, city leaders, regional councillors say they need to be listened to because when it comes to climate change, they're the ones on the front line. And when things go wrong, they're the ones facing the backlash too. Jeremy Wilkes at COP29 in Azerbaijan for Euronews.
Last night and this morning, the Russian army attacked Kiev and several other regions with UAVs and missiles. A warehouse caught fire in Brovary district of Kiev region, but the fire has been localized. Air raid warnings blared for hours on Wednesday as a total of 8 regions were targeted. 6 ballistic and cruise missiles and 90 drones were used in the attack, the Ukrainian Air Force reported. Some of the missiles and drones were intercepted by Ukrainian air defense systems. Russian Minister of Defense released footage of the airstrikes on a concentration of men and armored military equipment of the Ukrainian armed forces units in the border area of the Kursk region. The air assault came as 10,000 North Korean troops sent by Pyongyang to help Moscow are engaged in combat in Russia's Kursk border region. Also, in annexed Sevastopol, Russian telegram sources reported that the senior Russian naval officer of the Black Sea Fleet, Valery Trankovsky, was killed as a result of a car explosion. The war in Ukraine continues with no sign of de-escalation.
Nobody believes Crimea will ever go back to Ukraine as part of any final resolution to the war there, says former President of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso. Mr. Barroso led the European Commission from 2004 to 2014 the period when Putin first began his territorial incursions into Georgia and Ukraine. Speaking exclusively to Euronews, he says there was a feeling amongst member states that Crimea was a special case. And many countries rejected the ideas of strong sanctions for Putin following the annexation.
What do you think of the period, I suppose? I mean, do you think that the warnings weren't taken seriously? Was there a belief that in 2014 maybe we shouldn't escalate by applying such extreme sanctions against Russia for Crimea?
It's very easy today to say what should have happened afterwards, because we did not at that time had the information. We have to see what was possible at that time. The reality is that the governments were not ready to go further. That is the reality. The Commission will be ready to go further. But the governments were not ready to go further because of their own interests, and probably because they thought, and that's instinct, that what I'm going to say now, it's delicate, but I'm going to say it. Because at least in the back of our minds, or the minds of the European governments, was the idea that Crimea is a special case. That's why today, honestly, nobody believes that Ukraine is going to get back Crimea. That's the reality.
And what should we do now?
We should support Ukraine. And whatever happens with our American friends, we should support Ukraine. Because if not, it's not only going to be a tragedy for Ukraine, it's a very important country, but it's a tragedy for Europe. And it's going to be the best possible offer we give to the movements against democracy, against international law, against also our own values. If Russia and others that are now supporting Russia continue to say all over the world, including in the so-called global south, that Europe and the West, they are gone, they are decadent, they no longer count, democracy is completely corrupt ideology.
And the rest of the interview will be broadcast on Euronews' Europe Conversation next Thursday.
The Biden administration said that Israel made good but limited progress in increasing the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and that it therefore would not limit arms transfers to Israel as it threatened to do a month ago. The US had initially set a deadline last month for Israel to send more food and aid into Gaza or risk scale back military support. However, relief groups say conditions are worse than at any point in the 13-month-old war. The decision from the US, Israel's key ally and largest provider of arms and other military aid, comes despite aid organizations declaring that Israel has failed to meet US demands to allow greater humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. 8 international aid groups said in a report that Israel failed to meet the US criteria and in fact took steps that dramatically worsened the situation on the ground, particularly in northern Gaza.
Gazan children who were brought to Lebanon to treat their wounds are now finding themselves caught in another war, with serious consequences for their mental and physical health. After Israel expanded its war in Gaza to a new front in Lebanon, Gazan families there are now seeing destruction that reminds them of home. Hassan Abu Sitta, a British Palestinian surgeon who was active in Gaza, facilitated the arrival of many children to Lebanon.
We've tried to keep them as close to the hospital and shield them, because it is, I mean, there's a sense that, they've been through it before, and they, there's a lot of work that was done in terms of mental health and post-traumatic stress, and so it's been tough on them, and it's also been tough on them not knowing whether their treatment is going to continue or not.
The Hassan Abu Sitta Foundation stopped bringing wounded Palestinian children to Lebanon, but continues to treat the existing patients, while also turning to the treatment of more Lebanese children. Over 1,200 Lebanese children have been wounded since October 2023.
Germany's biggest industrial union reached an agreement over a wage dispute within the country's metal and electrical industry. The new agreement by trade union IG Metall stipulated a wage increase amounting to 5.5% over the next 25 months.
Wir haben in einer extrem schwierigen Situation mit sehr weit auseinanderliegenden Positionen die ganze Nacht hart und intensiv gerungen und wir haben Lösungen geschaffen.
Workers initially demanded a 7% wage increase over a period of 12 months. In response, employers had offered a wage increase of 3.6% over a period of 27 months.
Wir haben in vielen Fällen die Regelungen, die wir heute schon haben, die seit 2018 in der Tarifwelt vereinbart worden sind, weiterentwickelt.
Millions of employees at companies including Mercedes-Benz, BMW and Siemens will be affected by the agreement. Hundreds of thousands of employees across Germany have taken part in warning strikes over the last few weeks. The head of the Church of England resigned after an investigation found that he failed to tell police about serial physical and sexual abuse by a volunteer at Christian summer camps as soon as he became aware of it. Pressure had been growing on the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, since Thursday, when his refusal to accept responsibility for his failure to report the abuse in England and in Africa in 2013 kindled anger about a lack of accountability within the English Church. The news comes against the backdrop of widespread historical sexual abuse in the Church of England. A 2022 report by the Independent Inquiry Child Sexual Abuse Organisation found that deference to the authority of priests, taboos surrounding the discussion of sexuality, and a culture that gave more support to alleged perpetrators than their victims helped make the Church of England a place where abusers could hide.
Euronews. The news.